Hey there, today I want to talk to you about an old myth about the British Empire that's been cropping up a lot in my comments. It comes in different forms, but the basic idea is that the British were better colonial masters than the French were because the former British colonies are in better shape than the former French colonies in terms of institutions and the frequency of civil wars. Well, as much as I love sticking it to the French, today I am here to tell you that this idea is utter hogwash. This idea of better run British colonies persists because of another myth that the French and the British love to preserve. That's the idea that their empires were engaged in a serious struggle against each other in the 19th century. As I've been pointing out over the course of this series, there was no real competition. The French held a few scattered islands in a sea of British power. When we understand how power actually worked in the 19th century, we get a valuable clue as to why the French colonies have mostly underperformed since independence. It's because they mostly underperformed before the colonial experience even started. I apologize in advance for referring to real countries and real people in this way, but it's the truth. The British Empire got the valuable parts of the world. The French Empire got the scraps. The bulk of French Empire was in West Africa, a territory that was in economic ruins before the French got there. The wealthy empires that had once existed here were starved from the 1500s by the shift of international trade away from the land and to the oceans. The main industry after that was the European acceleration of the slave trade that had already been draining the region for 1,000 years under Islamic empires. By the time the French took over in the mid to late 1800s, the sub-Saharan African parts of the empire were economic wastelands because of the slave trade, and the North African parts were economic wastelands because of the end of the slave trade. Compare this to the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, the territories that make up today's Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Singapore. Prior to the first serious British conquests in the 1750s, these countries were the manufacturing center of the world, producing goods in far higher quantities and qualities than anyone in Europe could compete with. These shipping lanes were extraordinarily prosperous. If the Mughal Empire hadn't collapsed under its own weight in the early 1700s, Europeans would never have been able to take over India. When the British did take over, there were established tax systems and armies that the British could easily absorb. So when independence finally came between the 1940s and the 1970s, the countries that were kicking the British out looked like they were in much better shape than the countries that were kicking out the French. But that's because the territories that the British colonized were always richer and better organized than the territories that the French took over. It's actually kind of horrifying that the British managed to crush their rich industrial possessions enough that they were superficially comparable to the brutalized territories that the French took over. This whole idea of British colonial superiority is based on comparing countries with very different experiences. When you compare countries that are a little more similar, the British don't look so great. It's kind of hard to make a case that formerly British Nigeria is doing much better than the other West African countries that had to deal with French oppression. In Asia, I think it's fairly obvious that Vietnam, which forced out the French in 1954, is doing much better than nearby formerly British Myanmar, where a recent democratization process led to genocide and international condemnation. In North Africa, who's doing better? Egypt, with its bloodthirsty dictator and reliance on U.S. subsidies? Or Tunisia, with the only functioning democracy in the Arab world? Tunisia kicked out the French around the same time Egypt finished kicking out the British. Let me be clear here, I am not making a case for French imperialism. They were extraordinarily brutal, and they were even more reluctant to give up empire than the British were. A lot of the problems in West Africa today can be traced to the fact that, in some very real senses, the French never gave up on their African empire. That's a crime that's ongoing today. But we shouldn't pretend that the British were ever really any better. Post-colonial countries all over the world are succeeding despite imperial crimes, not because they got some nice institutions along with the mass starvation. Thanks for watching, please subscribe, and please check out my book, Avoiding the British Empire, that deals with all of these issues in more depth. And come back next time when we give the British Empire a break by finally covering the Tunisian elections.